Good afternoon, everybody. This is part 2. I'm going to convert this to slideshow. There we go. This is part 2 of the Starting a Nonprofit at Your Church webinar series. If you were not logged into part 1, I believe that you can still listen to that broadcast and view the PowerPoint. So maybe let us know if you need to do that, need instructions on how to do that. Last time I talked about the importance of considering the pros and cons of this model for your congregation. And so I think that's really essential for you to think about, maybe even form a team that's reviewing that. Find an attorney to help you with your legal process, and then to put some time into thinking about how much control the church would like to have over the nonprofit. Because some churches will form nonprofits, incubate them, and then really send them off to be more independent. Other churches have the nonprofit kind of almost enclosed within the congregation, so it's more control. This is a big giant picture of me, a little bit about me, and then if you've got questions after today's presentation or you're interested in some consulting work, you could email me at the Yahoo address. I do work directly with individual congregations on establishing nonprofits. Sometimes it's helpful to bring me in to talk to your church council, for example, about the options, or to work with a team on how this would be structured. I also teach on this all around the country, so if you're interested in having me teach for your group, you could also email me. This is my book with Judson Press, 7 Creative Models for Community Ministry. It's my latest book, and Starting a Nonprofit is one of the models described in the book. It's really a how-to on how to get more connected to your community and start some meaningful ministry. And these are my first 2 books. These are with other publishers, and Judson is good enough to let me have them up here on my PowerPoint. Starting a Nonprofit at Your Church was put out by the Alban Institute. It's now with Roman and Littlefield, so you can look it up on their website there. And then Winning Grants to Strengthen Your Ministry is with is for any church that's interested in accessing corporate and foundation funding for a ministry of their church. So it's really a step-by-step how-to. Well, like I said, this webinar focuses quite a bit on the board model. So I'm going to walk you through 3 models that I've developed. And you might be able to think of more. So write down your questions about this. And if you've got questions about some of the fine points of this or needing some more interpretation, we can definitely talk. So board model number 1 is the church board also functions as the nonprofit board. It's possible you could convene the group on the same night as the church board meeting. And an option with this model is that the nonprofit board could have its own advisory group of some sort, which would allow you to add in some people on the advisory board that have specific expertise or connections. One really nice thing about this board model is that it allows you to move forward quickly. So you don't have to spend the time, and I always suggest that you spend time establishing a separate board for a nonprofit. You need to think about what the board's going to do, what kind of board members do we need, where would we get them. This allows you to move ahead quickly. I also think that this model has a better chance of helping the church and the nonprofit stay connected to each other and stay in alignment. So it's the same people running both organizations, and so there's less chance of miscommunication or heading in a different direction. A downside of this model is that you do lose control of who serves on the board. So if your church board is going to be your nonprofit board, you kind of get who you get. So those board members may or may not have the skills and connections that the nonprofit needs. So say if you, here in town we have headquarters for General Mills and also Medtronic. And if you wanted to make connections with those companies to secure some funding or some volunteers, it would be a great idea to have an employee sitting on your board. You may or may not have that on your church board. The other thing about church boards is that people are often selected because of their interest in or their activity with a particular ministry area, and they may tend to identify with that area and not think a little bit more broadly. And so sometimes it's hard to get people to be interested in the nonprofit or see how it's relevant to their involvement at the church. I think this is one of the biggest downfalls, is that the church board really could have very little time to devote to the nonprofit. So one of the churches I served on the staff of, this was the model that was in place when I came to serve as the executive director of the nonprofit. And I just saw quickly that the nonprofit, which had a $250,000 budget at the time, would get about 10 minutes of the church board's time. And we needed to raise money, we needed to develop a strategic plan, I wanted to launch several new programs. We really needed a group to provide actual governance. And so not being able to devote the time could be a real pitfall of this. Model number 2 is when you develop a separate board to for the nonprofit, which has some accountability to the church. What level of accountability is it really up to you, and what issues or areas the separate board is accountable to the church is really up to you. So one way to develop that tie is to require that the nonprofit board have a certain number of church members on it. It's one way for the two organizations to stay connected. So some churches I work with say we would like a majority of our nonprofit board members to be members of the church, so that there's some alignment, that the church's interests are kept in mind as the nonprofit moves forward. And if you're really not interested in having a high level of control but just want representation from the church, maybe it's a few church members, 2 or 3, 1, like that. And the church could also have some decision-making authority or even some secondary approval over some key issues. So maybe it's just 1 or 2 issues, or maybe it's a number of issues, depending on what the church leadership decides as the nonprofit is being formed. So I'll go through what some of those options are in just a minute. But things like, if the nonprofit wants to change its direction or its mission statement, that would be a place where the church says, we'd really like to have decision-making authority over that. You make your decision as a separate board of the nonprofit and then bring it to the church board, and we need to approve that too. Important hiring decisions, important financial decisions are other examples. Yeah, and I just talked about this. So to have the right of secondary approval would be an option with this separate board. If you want more control, it could be a pretty long list of issues that the church could also sign off on. So it could be things like the sale of purchasing property, the sale of property or the purchasing of property, something that is expensive. It's a major undertaking for an organization, and perhaps your church would really want to be able to sign off on that also. The launch of major new programs, so say, I don't know, you wanted to launch a preschool out of your church-based nonprofit, and that requires a lot of money. It would require you retrofitting or updating buildings so that they meet the standards. You need to hire people that have certain credentials. So the church may say, this is like a major deal, and especially if it's going to be offered in the church building. Church board may want to be able to sign off on it. Let's see, I need to go back one. Well, another one would be approval of the annual budget or significant changes in the budget. So, the budget is going to be a lot larger. You decided to add a staff person. The building that you bought needed a lot more repairs than you anticipated, so you need to increase your budget. That would be the sort of thing that a church board might want to have secondary approval on. I wouldn't advise that you make it so that any variation needs to be approved by the church, because that would be micromanaging, but some significant changes maybe. And then another option would be if the organization decides to take a major change in direction. So really taking a right turn from where you've been, and like developing a new mission statement, a new vision statement. going into a whole different program area than you've been in before. You've been working with children and youth, and you're going to work with families instead, or in addition to working with children and youth. Some church-based nonprofits are very geographically based. You might have one neighborhood of the city, for example. So you're working in South Minneapolis, you decide you're going to also work in North Minneapolis, and there's a big difference between the two communities. So that would be a big change, for example. And then also in model number 2, you could still have some structural ties holding the church and the nonprofit together. And so that would, I think that's an upside of this one. It could be easier for the church and the nonprofit to stay connected to each other rather than model number 3, where I really talk about the nonprofit being set free to do as it sees fit. Another, I think the biggest bonus of this model is that you can recruit at least some of the board members from outside the church. And I think that would be one of the main reasons to have a separate board, would be that you have some flexibility here. And like I mentioned, could be people with different skill sets or different connections in the community. I think I'm working right now with a coalition of Lutheran churches, and we're putting together a parish council for them. It's a little different than starting a nonprofit at your church, but they're talking about we probably need some people who don't attend our churches, who live in this community, and who just know a lot about what's going on. Bring the community grassroots perspective to your work. So that would be another plus to having this sort of model. I think it can be challenging to bring together people from inside and outside the church. So just know that. I think it's one of the, I'm not going to say it's a downside of this model, but I think it's a challenge. So you might find they have differences in values. They might have differences in theology, in how they view the community, you know, a difference in work culture and the pace of work. So sometimes I find when I have community, I do a lot of work in city neighborhoods, community residents, also participating with people who may work in more of a corporate or business setting. Community residents are kind of used to community change taking a long time. Corporate types may be more accustomed to things moving quickly, kind of snapping your fingers on moving ahead. So I've experienced tension sometimes when I've been working with more community-based folks and corporate people on the same board. I also think this is a more difficult model to administer, so it requires someone to keep track of which decisions need a secondary approval from the church. And you know, also making sure that the church board reviews those decisions, and there's recording and communication and accountability there. So I think this is a little trickier to administrate than the other two models. And then model number 3 is the church with its board and the nonprofit with its board. So it's really a separate board that's autonomous from the church. There aren't structural ties between the two organizations, so the nonprofit's board is free to run the nonprofit as it sees fit. And this would give you complete freedom to recruit the board members that are needed by the nonprofit. So it's, like I said, people with the necessary skill sets and connections. A lot of times nonprofits like to have somebody who's an accountant or a financial management professional on their board. Maybe they'll serve as treasurer. You might need somebody that has property management or real estate skills. If you want to get into housing development, it would be really great to have somebody like that on your board. And this isn't to say you wouldn't include some people from the church on your board. It's just not a requirement. That's how I would describe it. And this model also allows you to establish your own culture and pace of work for the nonprofit. I think this is a great model for nonprofits that need to move more quickly than a church would. Not saying that churches get stuck in the mud, but I've certainly seen that happen. And so this really gives you some freedom to move this at the pace it might need to move at. I think a downside of this one is it can be harder to stay connected to the church. Because in this case, church and nonprofit leaders meet separately. They may not have many opportunities to build relationships with each other, share ideas and concerns. You know, and the nonprofit doesn't have formal accountability to the church, so may head in a different direction. And also this, finally, well, I think it's more possible that there'd be conflict between the church and the nonprofit with this model. Because without accountability and shared leadership, church and nonprofit leaders could disagree about things like mission, program focus, and spending. So I never tell churches that there's one right model. That's why I've developed 3. I've seen all 3 work. I've actually seen all three fail as well. I think the main determinant, I think there are a couple keys to success here. One would be to really lay out, like I talked last time, about really lay out how much control the church wants to have over the nonprofit at the outset before you start operating this organization with sort of unclear boundaries, unclear specifications about that. The other thing is that people having a spirit of grace and cooperation towards each other can make any of these models work. If people have a spirit of division and conflict, it could cause them all to fail. So I guess I'm saying finding people who are really interested in collaboration and valuing what the other organization offers and saying thank you. So I'll talk about that in a minute about how to maintain a positive relationship. So now I'm going to talk about forming a board. Let's see, I've got to go back one. There we go. So I've got 2 kinds of boards. They may be called different things in your world, but I've got a navigational board or a bigger picture board, and then I've got a tactical board, more hands-on. So I'll talk a little bit here about forming your board properly is probably the best thing you can do to get your nonprofit started on the right foot. So anyway, here's the navigational board. And a navigational board, the board members have a hold of the rudder. So they're steering the ship and making decisions related to that. So possible duties of the navigational board could include developing and reviewing the strategic plan, reviewing and approving the annual budget and the audit, and ensuring that the organization meets its annual goals for programs and operations. So it's really a pretty big picture view. Often, nonprofits shift to a navigational board when the organization has staff for the first time. So here's the next kind of board. This is more tactical. So if we're going to continue our ship or boat metaphor, it's steering and having hold of the rudder versus being on the deck and doing the work. So here happen to be some guys being shipmates and really grabbing a hold of things and doing the work. So they'd be raising the sails, swabbing the deck, down in the galley, cooking the meals. I'm liking this metaphor. I would say often startup nonprofits have tactical boards in the time before they have paid staff. And as organizations grow and add staff, they may move toward a more navigational board. So tactical board duties might be things like your board members are recruiting and training volunteers, actually running programs, because you might not have the money yet to hire program staff. They're writing grants and proposals and newsletters. Volunteers might actually run the office. So if you call the office, you'd get a volunteer on the phone, and they're preparing correspondence. And then also things like community relations. So board members would go out to community meetings, serve on boards or task forces in the community. Often when boards have the highest level of tension is when they need to shift from being one kind of board to another. And I do consulting work around that with a variety of organizations. So if things feel tense, start talking as a group about whether the role of your board is shifting. And usually it's shifting from more hands-on to bigger picture. But I will say I've worked with some groups since the financial crash in 2008 that needed to downsize. And so board members needed to become much more hands-on. And sometimes that meant they needed to switch up people who were on the board who were more interested in doing hands-on work. So if you're going to write a job description for board members, these are the kind of things that, well, I guess I wanted to talk about fundraising here. I think regardless of whether you have a tactical or navigational board, you should engage your board members in fundraising. So I think there are a variety of ways to invite board members into the fundraising process. So one would be actually to ask them to write grant proposals, or they might be involved in identifying and making connection with foundation or corporate funders. I also think that board members can play a critical role in connecting the organization to potential individual donors. With face-to-face meetings, your board members could bring a donor over to tour some of your programs when programs are operating, for example. Oops, I got to go back one. Another thing is that board members could be involved in is working on special events. So some of your volunteers might be brilliant at organizing, really setting this whole thing up. Others would be great at selling tickets or tables, really marketing it, getting all their friends to come, and some would be great at the logistics on the day of. So if you're in an organization that where an event would make sense for you, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to teach 2 more webinars in November on funding your community ministry. So that's something we forgot to say today. Those are 2 that you can sign up for as well. But I'll talk more about how to figure out whether a special event makes sense for you. But I've worked with some boards where there were just some real party people on the board that had tons of friends that like to go to events too, and that's probably an indication that it'd be a good thing for you to do as an organization. So I always advise people to develop a board member job description. I think when you put it in writing, it helps you clarify it. You know, the people in leadership or your team that's forming the nonprofit. And then when you go out to meet with prospective members, you can show them this document and say, these are the kinds of things that we're asking board members to do. So an important thing in your job description would be to define the duties. So we've talked about some of them already. You know, how are board members going to be involved in fundraising? You probably have financial management, oversight. They'd be reviewing and approving the audit every year, talk about how board members are engaged in human resources. So really define it and describe it. Then I think you also need to identify traits that you would like all board members to have. Define expectations. So if somebody signs up to do this, how much time are they going to have to put in? Are they expected to attend events? Do you want them to serve on a committee? About how many hours a month is this going to require? And then identify some desired skill sets that you're looking for. So here are some critical questions to ask yourselves when you are recruiting board members. And again, figuring out what's the tie to the church with the board. So how many board members will be from the church? How many can be from outside the church congregation? And identify the fact that your outsiders could bring in some needed skill sets that are not in the church. And like I said before, possible connections to groups that you need to connect with. So some possible skill sets you might want to target would be financial management, legal expertise, fundraising, HR, is the list. I think it's better to think hard about what you want your board members to do and what kind of skill sets you're seeking. I find a lot of people will identify people who they know who are nice and smart and put them on the board and not think about whether they're a good fit with the work that needs to be done for the nonprofit. And then you end up with board members that are pretty disengaged. I would say not a good fit. They may not do the work that you need. And then when I talked about traits that all board members should have, I think it's good to list those out as well. So when I work with groups, a lot of times we talk about things like being passionate about the cause, having personal integrity, level of faith belief. If that's really important for your nonprofit, describe that. You might say you want committed Christians or active at a church, or you might just say people who endorse Christian beliefs, or maybe that's not an issue for you. I've often put in mind, since I work with a lot of startups and turnarounds, that board members ought to enjoy working with startups or new projects. It's different than stepping into something that's been operating for a long time and may have layers of staff and everything all figured out. Or being a team player might be another trait. And then community representation. is another thing to consider. So do you want people from the communities you serve represented on your board? So if you're working with youth, do you want some youth or seniors, people living in a certain neighborhood or geographic area? If your nonprofit provides programming for people living in poverty, maybe you want some people living in poverty sitting on your board. So think about that as well as you're putting together your board member job description and your recruiting plan. Next step would be to put in some work to define the mission and vision of your nonprofit. So I'm just going to talk briefly about that. It's kind of a big topic, but I think before you launch, you really need to put some time into thinking about your vision. So what does the world look like when you are done with your work? So, you know, if you were going to do housing redevelopment in a particular community in the city, you might say there's, you know, the housing has been restored. We don't have rundown or boarded up buildings here. That's our vision. And there's enough for affordable housing for everyone in our community. So it's a big statement of what you hope happens. And then your mission. So it's answering, and people will debate me on what vision means and what mission means. This is my understanding of it, and it's how I lead nonprofits through the process of developing a strategic plan. So asking the question, what are you doing? Who are you working with? Where are you doing it? How are you doing it? And then what are the outcomes you want to achieve? So I do a lot of work with youth development nonprofits, and they might say, you know, we're working to help middle schoolers in the central neighborhood read and do math at grade level, something like that. Or if it was a bigger mission related to youth development, it would have some other components in it. So I think as you're putting this together, it's important to think of about a few things as you're looking at vision and mission for moving forward. What's God's call? I wish it was this easy. I wish there was a telephone booth and I could pick up the phone and God was on the other end. But to be able to discern as a group, what is God saying to you about the new ministry and what shape does it take? And who and what are needed to carry out that call? I think in discernment processes, prayer is really key. So spend some time in prayer together thinking about the vision and the mission of your nonprofit. I think scripture is key as well. I often work with congregations that have like a key theme or a key scripture related to what it is that they want to do. And they'll really meditate about that. They'll keep coming back to it over and over again and study it in a group and think. I think in discerning, there's often group process as well. So how can you engage people in your church in helping to discern God's call and what the ministry is to look like? Another important thing to think about is community needs and desires. So I spend a lot of time in my 7 Creative Models for Community Ministry book describing a Meet the Neighbors process, so what it actually looks like to get out into the community and talk to people. So in this case, a gentleman is interviewing a woman who is a senior who lives in the community to find out what seniors' issues and needs are. And having some community conversations. So maybe you invite some people in to talk about the community, or maybe you go to a community meeting and listen to them talk. This looks like a gathering of law enforcement professionals, possibly people from the public schools, talking about some critical issues affecting the community. So it's this issue. What is our community telling us they want us to do? So part of this is based on data. So demographic data, including the census, studies of particular needs like schools, health, and housing. And then as you're forming your nonprofit, ask about key operational issues. What are you qualified to do? So I think that's important because I think as churches, sometimes congregations will look out into the community and say there's this need out there, so we have to respond to it. Well, do you have the capacity to do something meaningful about this situation? Or maybe you need to partner or maybe you need to support the work of another group that really does have the capacity. I'm thinking about what ministry opportunities would we say no to and on what basis. So we might say no to something because it's outside of our geographic area. We might say no to something that doesn't involve our church members. And we might say no to some, like I said, some kinds of services and programs that we are not qualified to provide. So that's part of figuring out that vision and that mission is, sort of what's in our corral and what's outside of it. What are we going to work on and what are we not going to work on? Oh, I'm going to go back one. You can also consider the work of the relationship of your work to other organizations. I used to work at the Boys and Girls Club, so that's an organization that might be in your community. So thinking hard about, are we duplicating effort? Because you want to be all about multiplication, not duplication. And like I said, thinking about who else is providing services in the geographic area where you're serving, and what do they provide, and will your work duplicate their efforts or complement them? And then thinking about the relationship to the mission and vision of the church. So how does the nonprofit's mission and vision complement that of the church? Sometimes I work with churches that are starting nonprofits, and there might even be some similar phrases or some shared words between the church's vision statement and the nonprofit's vision statement. So if there's a focus in the church on, I'm working with a church right now that has environmental justice and sustainability in their church mission statement. So if they started a nonprofit, that might be present there as well to show the connection. And then thinking about how the nonprofit's vision and mission is distinct from the vision and mission of the church. And then will the nonprofit implement any of the church's programs for it? So I've had a couple of the places that I've actually worked on staff, we had this conversation. So, is it more appropriate for the church to implement the benevolence? So if people come in asking for rent help or some food assistance, is that a church program or is that a nonprofit program? Sometimes it's really hard to draw the line, so I think it's important to have this conversation as well. And finally, I'll just talk briefly about maintaining a positive relationship between the church and the nonprofit. And I want to say one more thing about vision and mission. I think the steps in this would be, you'll need to do that piece actually before you start on your legal process, because in the legal process you'll be asked to provide your vision statement, the key programs that you're going to be focusing on or program areas, develop a 3-year budget for the organization that would include programming. So yeah, I think that really think about what this, you almost have to do a regular strategic planning process for the nonprofit as you're starting it, even though it's connected to the church. So regardless of the board model that you choose, it's best for the ministry if church staff and nonprofit staff find ways to get along and work together. The congregation is informed about the nonprofit and invited to participate in some way. And there's just an overall sense of cooperation and alignment of missions. It's easy for that not to be the case unless you work at it. Because I think this can be a confusing model for people sitting in the pews. So there might be a sense of competition, for volunteers, financial resources, for space within the church building. So you want to nip that in the bud before it becomes too deeply entrenched in people, I would want to say. And I think a lot of that has to do with how the leaders of both organizations demonstrate their sense of cooperation towards each other. So I'm going to talk here about how you can do that. I think it'd be good to communicate about the nonprofit in the church bulletin and newsletter. So put in blurbs about programs, results, opportunities to give time and money. And the nonprofit may eventually have its own newsletter, which you can distribute to the congregation. I think getting in front of the congregation on a regular basis is important too. I used to ask for it about quarterly or more often when we were running some big programs. So one of the churches I served at, we did a huge summer program for the youth of the community. So I was in front of the church congregation on a regular basis starting in the end of April, probably through July, talking to them about programming that was coming up, how many kids we had coming, asking for money, and asking them to donate stuff. So this would be things like Sunday morning announcements from the pulpit. I even wonder about doing a sermon occasionally on texts that are related to the work of the nonprofit, speaking at all church events, like an annual meeting or a banquet, or speaking to the new members class. I've done that before as well, so that right when people are coming into the church, they get that you have an attached nonprofit. And then invite church members to participate in the work of the nonprofit. So I think offering a variety of volunteer opportunities is good. Some people like to do face-to-face work with people, so maybe that would be coaching someone in language through an ESL program, or mentoring someone who's looking for a job. Some people like to do behind-the-scenes work, so it might be set up and tear down. It might be going out and buying supplies that you need. You might have some people that are gifted at fundraising or communicating. So think about how you can ask people to engage. I think it's important to ask the church for money, assuming that the church says this is okay. It's not good to surprise people with fundraising asks. So I found it really helpful to ask for some support from church members of specific projects. So in the case of our summer program, we asked for camp scholarships to underwrite the bike trip and our canoe trip for junior high boys. And we also had a medical clinic, and so we asked people to help underwrite clinic visits was another option. A tutoring program in the schools, and we had it broken down by how much it costs to support one student in the schools for the entire school year. I think it was $2,400. And we had some people that took us up on that because they really wanted to help the kids learn how to read. And I think in-kind donations are a really good thing to ask for as well. Church members often really like to do that. So it might be, I don't know, craft supplies, it might be snacks, might be clothing items. One year we did a drive for swimsuits because a lot of the kids we were serving didn't have swimsuits or sleeping bags to go to camp. So really there's a variety of ways that you can engage church members. And then I think it's really good if staff members of both organizations meet together regularly. So for sure, the director of the nonprofit and the senior pastor of the church, program staff members of each organization, once you get that big. So if you have, say you've got an arts program through the nonprofit and have a community choir, that person connecting with your worship director or worship pastor at the church I think would be really good. So connecting in that way, you can coordinate programming, and how each group's going to communicate with the congregation and how they ask for participation too. So you're not double dipping or overlapping or confusing people with the way that you're communicating. And I think I mentioned this, including the nonprofit and annual church events. So the church banquet, annual meetings. I think it would be great if part of the program would be that the nonprofit would give a brief update on its activities and include some ways that church members can participate. It's nice to have something to distribute to people in this setting, so whether it's a little brochure or your latest newsletter, or have a table where people can drop by and sign up to help out with things. So I guess a key theme of what I'm saying here is to be communicating to the people in the church on a regular basis. I think, like I said in the last session, one of the downsides of this model of having a church-based nonprofit is that people in the church might let go of ownership of their responsibility to do work in the community. But I think the best practice here is to really continue to ask church members to be supportive, because those resources, their time and their money can be leveraged to bring in other support from outside your church congregation. And so it's that just multiplies many times over. So I think that's a big part of the potential of this model. So that's the end of my formal presentation. And I am now open for taking some questions. You can ask me about anything.
All right, Joy, I'm just monitoring to see if anyone has a raised hand, or if you'd like, you could type in a question as well.
One that I looked at recently is, are you getting an echo with my phone?
No, but I was just going to say we do have one question here.
Okay, great.
Okay, I'm going to open up the line right now to Ursel. Hi, Ursel.
Let me get my microphone in place. My question is, how important is it, no matter what kind of board structure you have, how important is it to have a, say, the pastor or a member of the clergy staff, ministerial staff, represented on your board?
Some churches decide to do that. Some decide not to. So I think it's really up to you, and just think about the purpose behind that. Pastors are really busy, so that'd be a downside of it. So I find sometimes we can't make meetings, but I think an upside of it would be the pastor having a really clear understanding of what the nonprofit's doing and valuing it.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't seem like it's a competitive organization for the church.
Yeah, and I can think that perhaps if you're doing something or work with perhaps children in the community, children's minister might be a helpful contact, or if you're doing youth ministry, perhaps the youth minister would be a good person to have on the board.
Yes, I would agree with that. So sometimes that person is more important to have on the board than your senior pastor, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're a senior pastor or not, but maybe I just insulted you. But yeah, people's plates are so full. So I think the point of it would be to try and keep the two organizations together and moving together.
Yeah, good. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursel. All right. If there are no other questions, and I'm not seeing any at this time, but please feel free, if you do have a follow-up question for Joy, you can contact her at her email address, which is listed, as well as you'll have her contact information in the presentation that I will be forwarding in the next day or so.
And Linda, can you say something about the next webinar?
Yes. I want to thank you, Joy. I did get a really good nugget as to the church's decision to either start a program, partner with someone who's already working in that space, or supporting another organization that's working in that space. That was really good. I can take that back to my church. So I thank you, and I encourage everyone who's attending to go out to www.judsonpress.com and take a look at 7 Creative Models for Community Ministry, which is the Judson Press book that Joy authored. And if you decide to order that book online, you will receive 20% off of the retail price. Joy is hosting in November another series of webinars titled Funding Your Community Ministry. Part 1 will begin on November 4th, and then a second follow-up session will be held on November 11th. Registration information will be contained in the email that also has the today's presentation on it. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.